Hi, I'm Lisa Rangel from Chameleon Resumes, the premier executive resume writing company, and thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I am going to talk to you about three main frustrations that I have with executive job search and executive resume writing advice. So, Lord knows there is a ton of resume and job search advice out there, and while there's a lot of well-meaning people, through some of the live resume and profile critique sessions that I've done over the last few months, I can see that there's so much bad advice out there, and it's I don't know, this may be a little bit of a rant, but I don't know, I've seen so much of it in the last few months that I just feel the need to, at risk of being catty, I just feel the need to do a video on it. And you know what? I'm just one other person also, right? I'm not saying what I say is gospel or that I'm the end-all be-all by any stretch, but I'm going to ask you to maybe use this video as a filter for when you're about to apply resume advice that you get, even if it's from me, to make sure it applies to you, and see if you're not possibly falling into the web of this, possible bad advice that maybe it's advice that shouldn't apply to you. So how do you know? That's a good question. So I'm going to go through that with some of with the three frustrations that I'm going to share with you today. So frustration number one that I have is that I see, career coaches, resume writers, interview coaches, job landing coaches give advice that they're basically giving general advice, but they're doing it in such an emphatic, absolute way that they're not factoring in a person's unique situation or the goal that they have in mind, and frankly, both. You need to factor in someone's background and their goal to come up with a strategy of what's going to be right for them. And the mistake of applying just general rules, right? General suggested rules of engagement and without digging into somebody's background, what their struggles are, what their goals are, to come up with something specific for them, I think is a mistake. And frankly, it can even be damaging. And, there's so many examples of it, how to handle a gap. There's so many different ways to handle a gap, an employment gap, especially if it's a recent one. How to handle lots of experience on your resume without necessarily getting, where you're suffering from ageism, which obviously is never okay, but clearly people make decisions that they shouldn't with information they shouldn't. So how do you help yourself by not positioning yourself in a way that could be used as ageism? There's so many different, how far back do you go up on a resume? The general rule is 15 to 20 years. There might be certain scenarios where it makes sense to not go back further than 10. There might be situations where you're going to go back further than 20, based on what their goal is, the industry they're in, and what they bring to the table. So, I find that when this general rule is applied to somebody and they're not factored, their background or their goal are not factored into the decision, it's frustrating, and I think it can do a lot of people a disservice. Here's something that you can do. Every decision you make on your resume should not generate a negative question on behalf of the interviewer, right? So, if you feel that there's something about your background that can cause a negative question, do something to address it so it basically makes it a non-issue or puts it in a positive light. That's really the goal. And based on that being the goal, it's hard to not, you can't just use general advice all the time for every scenario. If it's a college grad or it's a senior person with 30 years of experience, or is it an industry that has people, candidates in demand? Is it an industry that has a flood of candidates and, it's more competitive? Those are all different scenarios that warrant different strategies in how information is handled on a resume. So general information that's being, doled out in this emphatic, absolute way without giving credence to somebody's background is one massive frustration that I have. So second big frustration that I have with regards to executive resume writing and job search advice is the person giving the advice, it's clear that they don't really understand modern marketing techniques. They're not familiar with how email subject lines matter. They're not familiar with how, seeing the first few characters of a LinkedIn headline or a headline of a resume or the top third of a resume, which is similar to seeing like the top third of, above the fold on a website. They don't know what above the fold means. Like things like that. When they don't understand general marketing concepts, and yet a resume, a profile, are marketing documents to be used in a job search, which to me is ultimately a marketing campaign where you are marketing yourself to, hopefully land a position. So this is essentially a marketing exercise. The job search at every level is a marketing exercise. And if someone is advising on how to do this and they don't understand modern marketing principles, I think it makes it hard to make suggestions, because again, the suggestions you should be making about where your information is placed on a resume or a profile, or what words to use, right? Because words matter, copywriting. If you don't understand how the marketing is working behind all of those decisions, I think it's hard to make recommendations that are going to matter. So, that's something that's a frustration of mine, is that I feel like career documents now are marketing documents, and if they're not factored into utilizing modern marketing techniques, I think it makes it harder to say that they're going to be successful. So that's another frustration of mine. And then the third frustration of mine, and this one may be a little controversial, is I don't think every recruiter and HR person necessarily knows how to dole out the right advice. And believe me, I basically stake, our credibility as a company on the fact that everyone on my team has search firm or corporate recruiting experience or both, and we do all of our writing and coaching with our work with clients from that, firsthand perspective of how hiring works, how ATSs work, and coming up with the search plans for individuals to use based on that experience. But I can tell you, it's like getting a haircut, right? Just because you get haircuts for years doesn't necessarily mean you know how to cut hair, right? Now, every recruiter or HR person who has firsthand experience of how hiring works doesn't necessarily know how to do a job search, right? It doesn't automatically translate into the other direction. And believe me, a lot of people from my industry of recruiting know what they're talking about, but let me tell you, there's a lot that don't. And here's sort of a litmus test you can use, search firm recruiters, while very helpful, you want to make sure that they're understanding that hiring happens outside of what they do every day. There's networking that happens. There's candidates that get hired not getting sourced. Every company has a different hiring process. Not everyone is hiring the same way a particular recruiter might if they're at a company for 10 years as a corporate recruiter. Every company hires differently, and then there's people that get hired through search firms, and that's about 10 to 15% of hires. And so, when a recruiter comes across that this is the only way things happen, I start to wonder, because I know when I recruited, there's people who got hired in ways that I didn't think were going to happen. So there's many ways to get hired, and the key, it comes back to, what's the goal of the candidate, what's the goal, what's their background, and how do you best showcase that background to hit the goal. And that may be differently than what a particular HR person or a particular recruiter might be accustomed to. Same way with search firm recruiters, very helpful in many ways, but I know when I was a search firm recruiter, when I first started anyway, I was really experienced and knowledgeable about how, the dozen or so clients that I had wanted to see their candidates being presented, how they wanted to see resumes. But Lord knows there were other clients within our firm that wanted to see resumes differently, and those search, managers knew how to present their candidates to those clients accordingly. And then, Lord knows there's people who get hired outside of search firms, and so resumes may need to look differently. Resumes need to look differently if you have someone introducing you or acting as your broker, essentially, like in the form of a search firm recruiter presenting you to a company, or an internal recruiter presenting you to their client manager. or someone referring you into a job. The resume can look differently than you marketing yourself outright without anyone introducing you. Because obviously in that latter part where you're marketing yourself, that resume is doing the selling. There isn't an intro or, an endorsement of somebody referring you in. So these are all different scenarios that you have to factor into the strategy in creating a resume, a profile, and an approach to an organization. And, not every recruiter has experience in all of those different areas. And so you need to be able to factor in, how is this person going to land the job? And then how do you go about positioning themselves to make sure that they're being noticed by the person who's going to be receiving that document or receiving that approach. So so anyway, and then, the HR people, they may manage a whole, talent process, but they themselves haven't necessarily sourced a candidate in years. They're maybe getting candidates once they've been sourced or once they've even been filtered through a few initial screening processes. And so, they haven't had hands-on experience on how to source the candidates or where they're found or how they're found. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't mean that as a dig, but it's just, if you don't have experience sourcing, you may not necessarily know how to be found, right? So, or if you're in a position of hiring in your company, but someone else is finding the candidates for you to interview, that's a different process, right? So you may not understand what it takes to be found if you're constantly having candidates delivered to you because they're sourced by someone else. So, again, people have to be humble enough to know, I'm not sure about that. That's not my area of expertise. You might be better served by X. Why don't you go look up this resource? Or here's an association that might be able to help you. Every interview coach, resume writer, recruiter, everyone in my space here, we all don't know everything. None of us know everything, and we all have different areas of expertise. And I always get a little weary when someone from our space says, here's how it's done and here's my experience because it's how it needs to be. It's like, this might be work in one niche. It's not going to necessarily work in another niche, so that's just a frustration of mine too, because we're in a position of helping people. And if we don't say when we can't help, and we're always in a position of helping, but that information can be wrong, we can be doing someone a disservice. And anyway, so I just wanted to say that. I want us all to be responsible. I want us all to be able to help, and but also defer to others when we know we're not the best people to offer that advice, which I do quite often, frankly. So anyway, if you like what you've heard, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, I would love for your comments below. If you would like to explore working with us and have us evaluate if we think we can help you, and have you evaluate if you want us to help you, feel free to explore that. I have an offer at the link below, and we can go on an exploration path and see if we're right to work together. But I welcome the feedback from people in my industry, and what do you see out there? Am I wrong? Am I right? I welcome a healthy debate, and I look forward to the discussion. Take good care, everybody. Be safe.